Progress is a good thing, but sometimes human progress can be pretty terrifying. We live in a world where a single button press can wipe us all out. And it might sound unbelievable, but during the Cold War, the destruction of either side depended on just one push of a button. When we look back at that era, we realize just how lucky we were that the world didn't end and we all didn't turn into ashes. In 1962, the world was caught between two selfish superpowers that wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than total control. That year, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. In 1961, the US decided to overthrow the Cuban government. That move pushed Cuba to ask the Soviet Union for help. At that time, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was overjoyed when Cuba asked for his support, and that was because Cuba was one of the geographically closest countries to the US. Not only did the Soviets help Cuba with military and economic aid, but also they went a step further and secretly sent nuclear missiles there. The USSR had never responded to a call for help that fast before, thus the Soviet communists were thrilled as they were getting closer and closer to Florida. The Soviet communists deemed this move completely fair. After all, the US had placed its own nukes in Turkey and Italy to threaten the Soviets. Thus, the Soviets figured that if America had the right to threaten them, they can intimidate it right back by putting nukes in Cuba too. Day by day, the tension between these two superpowers kept growing until when the US spy plane flying over Cuba discovered Soviet nuclear missiles on the island, just miles away from American territory. On the same day, when an emergency meeting was being held in the US on October 16, 1962, all the generals agreed that the Soviet nukes in Cuba had to be destroyed. They planned to send in bombers and wipe out every missile base and ammo site in Cuba. But the US president of that time, John F. Kennedy, refused, deeming such a move moronic. Instead, he suggested stopping all ships heading to Cuba, basically cutting the island off. And instead of calling it a blockade, they named it a quarantine, so that it would sound less aggressive. Still, there was a big problem to this. Stopping another country's ships in international waters is basically seen as a declaration of war, as those ships aren't in your territory yet. Therefore, when Khrushchev found out about this, he was furious. He quickly wrote a letter to Kennedy that would say, if you do this, you're basically declaring war on us, and that could turn into a nuclear war. It was after a letter when the most dangerous era of the Cold War began. A time when the Cold War could have turned into a hot rail war at any seconds, leading to a nuclear fire that would burn down the whole world. In response to Khrushchev's letter, John F. Kennedy declared that blocking his ships comes after Khrushchev's nukes out of Cuba. Khrushchev claimed that the missiles weren't for war. They were just to protect Cuba. But with every message back and forth, the tension just kept growing. On October 27, 1962, the US sent the Lockheed U-2, one of its best spy planes piloted by Rudolph Anderson, over Cuba to gather more intel. But the plane was spotted by Soviet radar and was shot down with a missile. It was on the same day too when a US Navy ship stationed near Cuba picked up signs of a submarine passing through. So they dropped the depth chart not to destroy it, but as a warning, offering a chance for negotiation. With the Soviet misunderstanding, as there were no radio connection to anyone deep underwater, they assumed that the war had already started. Rushing to the nuclear missile on board, they were ready to fire. By their rules, 3 people had to approve of such a nuclear launch. The submarine's captain approved, so did one of the officers, but the third person didn't. That man was Vasily Arkhipov. At that time, the fate of the world was in Vasily's hands, as no one knew how many more nuclear bombs might go off after the launch. No matter how much the other 2 tried to convince him, he refused to agree, holding the lives of millions of people. On that night, as all of this was happening inside the Soviet submarine, the Soviet ambassador in the US met with the president's brother Robert Kennedy only to compromise. The US would remove its nuclear weapons from Italy and Turkey, as well as the Soviet pulling out of Cuba completely. The fun part of this whole thing is that on the very next day, the Soviets began packing up and withdrawing from Cuba. And after that, people in both countries started mocking their governments. Americans making fun of Kennedy and the Russians laughing at Khrushchev, having no idea how close the world had become to total destruction. With a nuclear bomb going off, most of the world and its people would have been wiped out, and the survivors would have been stuck living in hell had Vasily approved of that missile launch that night. Vasily did something huge, and rightfully so. Later on, the world saw him as a hero, saying that he deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. People believed that had he been selfish, he would have agreed, but he knew what would happen if so, therefore he didn't. What do you think? Do you think the US would have their response with their own nukes if Vasily had approved of that launch? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more.